Part 1. Teeth were doomed from the start. If you want to understand cowboy dentistry, you first have to understand cowboy teeth. And the truth is simple. They never stood a chance. From the moment a young hand left home and saddled up for the trail, his mouth was already doomed by the diet, the habits, and the plain fact that the West had bigger problems than clean molars. Cowboys lived on beans, coffee, jerky, biscuits, and whatever sugar they could find to sweeten the endless cups of bitter black brew. Add tobacco, chewed, smoked, or both, and you had a recipe for disaster. Sugar ate through enamel, tobacco stained and rotted, and coffee did the rest. By 20, most cowboys already had teeth that looked like they belonged to old men. By 30, if they lived that long, their smiles were mostly gaps. Toothbrushes weren't part of a cowboy's gear. Soap, maybe, a spare shirt, if he was lucky, but a stick for cleaning teeth rare. Some men chewed willow twigs or rubbed salt across their gums when reminded. Most didn't bother. When you worked 16 hours a day in dust, heat, and storms, brushing your teeth was about as likely as ironing your shirt. Cowboys joked that the trail dust cleaned their mouths better than anything else. They weren't far wrong, but it didn't help much. Dentistry, as we'd call it today, simply didn't exist on the frontier. There were no regular checkups, no clean white chairs, no dentists with neat drills. The only time a cowboy thought about his teeth was when one started to ache so badly he couldn't eat, drink, or sleep. And by then, it was too late. An aching tooth was as good as a death sentence for that tooth. Relief meant only one thing: pulling it out. Pain was constant. Cowboys got used to it the way they got used to blisters, bruises, and scars. A dull throb in the jaw was ignored until it became a sharp agony that spread through the head. Men drank more coffee to numb it, chewed tobacco on the other side of the mouth, or asked the cook for a slug of whiskey before bed. But nothing worked for long. At some point, the cowboy had to admit the truth. That tooth had to go. And that's when the real horror started. Because there were no dentists out there. There were only cowboys, each as ignorant as the next, armed with whiskey, pliers, and a willingness to get the job done. Sometimes it was a barber, sometimes a blacksmith, sometimes a friend around the fire. The method didn't matter. The end was always the same: fewer teeth, a lot of shouting, and a grin a little more crooked than before. The West wasn't built for beauty, and smiles weren't spared. Cowboys rarely showed their teeth in portraits. They knew better. A shadowy grin, lips closed, looked better than a mouthful of gaps. But when they laughed around the fire, the truth showed: dark stains, missing molars, crooked fangs that looked more outlaw than hero. That was the beginning of cowboy dentistry. Not with drills or polish, but with beans, coffee, tobacco, and neglect. By the time the pain came, the teeth were already too far gone. The only solution was as brutal as the land itself. Take another drink of whiskey, grab something strong, and prepare to lose another piece of yourself to the trail. The horror wasn't in the pulling itself. The horror was knowing that every cowboy carried the same fate in his mouth, waiting its turn. Part 2. Whiskey and pliers. When a cowboy's toothache grew bad enough that he couldn't chew beans, couldn't drink coffee without wincing, and couldn't sleep without waking half the camp with groans, everyone knew it was time for the procedure. And procedure was a generous word. There were no reclining chairs, no sterile gloves, no white aprons. Just a campfire, a bottle of whiskey, and whatever tool someone thought looked closest to dental equipment. Whiskey was the only anesthetic on the frontier, and even that didn't do much. A cowboy would swig until his words slurred and his head lolled. Sometimes his friends held him upright. Sometimes they just let him slump against a wagon wheel. The more he drank, the less he cared about the pliers waiting in someone else's hand. But no matter how much he swallowed, he was never drunk enough to forget what came next. Tools varied. Pliers were the favorite if anyone had them. Otherwise, tongs from the cook's fire, a hunting knife wedged just right, or even a hammer handle to knock the bad tooth loose. Cowboys didn't worry about precision. The goal wasn't saving the tooth, it was ending the pain. That meant pulling hard, fast, and praying the tooth came out before the cowboy sobered up enough to fight back. It wasn't a quiet affair. Neighbors knew when a cowboy was having dental work done. The sounds carried, groans, curses, shouts, and sometimes laughter from the men doing the pulling. Everyone in camp gathered close, not out of sympathy, but for entertainment. On the trail, a tooth extraction was as close to theater as you could get. The unlucky patient cursed his friends, swore at his horse, even promised to quit tobacco. Forever, promises that lasted until the pain faded. When the tooth finally came out, triumph swept through camp. The cowboy might be pale, shaking, and spitting into the dirt, but at least the throbbing agony was gone. A bloody molar was passed around like a trophy. Some men kept theirs in pouches, a grim souvenir of survival. Others tossed them into the fire without a second thought. Either way, another gap joined the grin, and life rolled on. Aftercare was simple: more whiskey, maybe a rag stuffed into the gap, and a pat on the back. Infection was a constant risk, but cowboys shrugged it off. If fever came, they sweated it out. If the wound healed, they went back to chewing jerky with half a mouth. No one expected perfect health. The West was about endurance, not comfort. By the time a cowboy hit 25, he'd likely had at least one of these makeshift extractions. Some lost half their teeth this way. One painful evening at a time. Campfire dentistry wasn't elegant, but it was efficient, at least by frontier standards. The pain ended, the herd kept moving, and the cowboys had another story to tell. The horror of cowboy dentistry wasn't only in the crude methods. It was in the fact that everyone accepted it. A hammer and a bottle of whiskey became a substitute for years of medical science, and no one blinked. On the frontier, survival didn't ask if it hurt. It asked if you could still ride tomorrow. And if you could, then whiskey and pliers had done their job. Part 3: Blacksmiths and barbers. Cowboys trusted whiskey and pliers around the campfire. Then in town they faced a different kind of horror. Professional amateurs on the frontier. Dentist wasn't a real job. Instead, barbers and blacksmiths filled the gap. Two men with steady hands and sharp tools, but very little knowledge of the human mouth. Barbers were already halfway there. They had chairs, mirrors, sharp razors, and the reputation of being men of precision. A cowboy with a toothache could stumble into a barber shop, slump into the leather chair, and hope the man who shaved beards could also manage molars. The barber would nod confidently, spin his tools, and produce something that looked halfway between pliers and scissors. He'd tie a cloth across the cowboy's chest, not for hygiene, but to keep him from flailing too much. Then came the whiskey, the grip of the barber's steady hand, and the yank. Blacksmiths, on the other hand, were chosen for their strength. If you wanted a horseshoe forged, a wagon wheel fixed, or a tooth pulled, the blacksmith was your man. His workshop smelled of soot, fire, and iron, and if you were unlucky enough to sit in his chair, you might find yourself staring at the same tongs he used on glowing metal. Cowboys believed that if the smith could bend iron, he could surely pull a tooth, and he did, usually with enough force to make sure the tooth came out, along with anything unlucky enough to be attached. Neither barber nor blacksmith offered much comfort. Numbing meant whiskey, sometimes a rag soaked in it, pressed against the gum. Lighting meant lanterns or the glow of the forge. Cleanliness wasn't in the vocabulary. Tools were wiped on aprons, dunked in a water bucket, or simply picked up from the floor. Cowboys didn't complain. They were too busy gripping the armrests or the smith's workbench and praying for the job to end. Fast. And yet, both professions thrived as dentists by default. Cowboys lined up after long drives, desperate for relief. A barber might cut hair, trim a beard, and pull a tooth all before lunch. The blacksmith could chew a horse in the morning and yank molars in the afternoon. Nobody trusted them, but nobody had better options either. The pain made even the roughest cowboy willing to gamble. Stories spread of barbers cracking more than teeth, of smiths pulling the wrong molar, of cowboys staggering out with more gaps than they'd gone in with. But for every horror story there were 10 men smiling, crooked, bloody, but relieved. Pain was the true enemy, and anyone who could end it, even for a while, earned grudging respect. The irony was that these makeshift dentists became local legends. In towns where lawmen came and went, where saloons burned down and were rebuilt twice a year, the barber with the strong arm or the blacksmith with the iron tongs became constants. Cowboys remembered them not because they were good, but because they were their dots. So when cowboys spoke of dentistry, it wasn't about drills or doctors. It was about the barber with steady hands and the blacksmith with iron tools. Two professions that never asked to be dentists, but became them anyway, because the West didn't wait for specialists. It made do with whoever had the guts to pull hard and not flinch. And the cowboys, gap-toothed and grateful, rode on. Part 4. Grins of the West. Be the end of it all. The beans, the tobacco, the whiskey extractions, the barber's steady hand and the blacksmith's iron grip. A cowboy's smile was nothing like the white-toothed grins you see in Hollywood posters. It was a patchwork of gaps, crooked stumps, and stains that told the story of every trail, every fight, and every procedure he had endured. And yet, that grin became a badge of honor. Cowboys didn't hide it. They showed it off around campfires, laughing through missing molars, boasting about which tooth came out fastest, and teasing greenhorns about how long their pretty smiles would last. The veterans knew the truth. Nobody kept all their teeth on the frontier. If you still had half by 25, you were lucky. The West didn't care about perfect teeth. What mattered was endurance. A cowboy who could still chew jerky, sip scalding coffee, and shout over a herd was good enough. If he had to gum his beans or bite with a crooked jaw, so be it. He was alive, he was working, and he had one more scar to prove it. Teeth were just another casualty of the trail, like broken bones, rope burns, or bullet scars. Photographs from the era show stiff, serious cowboys staring into the camera. Few ever smiled with their mouths open. They knew better. Their pride wasn't in showing a perfect row of teeth, but in surviving without them. Closed lip smirks, shadowy expressions, and grim stares were safer. Behind those lips, the reality was often a mouth hollowed out by the West itself or still. Around the fire, when the whiskey flowed and songs rose into the night, the real grins came out. Lopsided, gap-toothed, often with more gums than enamel, but genuine. Those grins carried the spirit of the frontier more honestly than any polished smile ever could. They weren't about beauty, they were about survival, humor and hardship, and pride in enduring what most men back east would never face. Cowboys themselves leaned into the joke. "This here's my gold tooth," one might say, pointing to an empty gap. Another would laugh. Plenty of room for the beans. In a world where pain was constant, humor was the only medicine that worked every time. And their grins, however broken, carried that medicine better than any bottle of tonic. The horror of cowboy dentistry wasn't just the pain of pulling teeth with pliers, or the filth of blacksmith's tongs. It was that the result was permanent. Every cowboy carried his dental history in his smile. Each missing tooth was a chapter, each crooked line a memory. Their mouths were ledgers, recording every bargain made with whiskey, every mistake with tobacco, every desperate night when the pain had to end no matter the cost. So when you picture the West, don't imagine bright, white smiles shining under wide-brimmed hats. Imagine gap-toothed grins under the stars, cowboys slapping knees, howling laughter despite the holes where teeth used to be. Those grins weren't pretty, but they were real as the dust, the storms, and the endless miles of trail. And in the end, that was the true cowboy smile. Crooked, scarred, half-toothed, but still proud. Because if the West could knock out half your teeth and you could still grin at it, you'd proven yourself tougher than most.